The Mongol Empire, conquerors of the world. No cities, no writing, no hope. Yet the Mongols forged an empire greater than Rome's in a single lifetime. What made them unstoppable? Hello and welcome to Why We Wonder. Imagine a people with no cities, no stone buildings, and no written language. A society of nomadic herders living in felt tents on the endless grasslands of Central Asia. By all accounts, these scattered tribes should have never unified, let alone conquered. And yet, within a single lifetime, they would forge the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. This is the story of the Mongols. So how did they do it? How did a collection of feuding nomadic clans unite under one leader to subjugate kingdoms from Korea to Hungary? How did warriors on horseback defeat the sophisticated armies of China, Persia, and Russia? Tonight we will tell the epic story of the Mongol Empire, from its explosive birth on the steppes to its transformation into the foundation of modern Eurasia. We will ride with Genghis Khan as he forges a nation from chaos. We will witness the strategic genius that allowed mounted archers to crush stone fortresses. We will follow Mongol armies as they swept across 3 continents in a wave of conquest that changed the course of human history. This is a story of unprecedented military brilliance and devastating destruction. It is also the story of unexpected tolerance, innovative governance, and the creation of trade networks that connected East and West like never before. But before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of thundering hooves, silk-wrapped diplomats, and the vast open skies of the Eurasian steppe. The story of the Mongol Empire begins not in a palace or a city, but in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Central Asian steppes. This was a world of extremes, blistering summers where temperatures could soar above 100 degrees, brutal winters where the cold could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. It was an ocean of grass, stretching for thousands of miles with no permanent settlements, no roads, and no clear borders. This was not a land that could support large settled populations. There was no agriculture, no mining, and no cities. But it was perfect for one thing: horses. The Mongols were not a single unified people. They were a collection of loosely related nomadic tribes, each moving seasonally across the grasslands with their herds of horses, sheep, and goats. Their lives revolved entirely around these animals. Mars milk was fermented into arag, a mildly alcoholic drink that was a staple of their diet. Mutton provided meat. Sheepskin and felt made from wool were used to construct their portable homes, the iconic round tents known as gurs or yurts. And above all, there were the horses. A Mongol without a horse was nothing. From the earliest age, Mongol children learned to ride. By the time they were 5 or 6 years old, they could stay mounted at a full gallop. Boys learned to shoot arrows from horseback, to hunt, and to survive in the wilderness. This was not military training. This was simply life. But it meant that every adult Mongol male was, by default, a highly skilled mounted warrior. The harsh environment forged a people of extraordinary toughness and resilience. They could ride for days with minimal food and water. They could sleep in the saddle. They could endure heat, cold, hunger, and exhaustion that would break soldiers from softer lands. But for all their individual toughness, the Mongol tribes were politically fractured. They were organized into clans and subclans, each led by a khan or chieftain. These groups were in a constant state of competition and conflict. Raids were common. Blood feuds could last for generations. A strong leader might unite several tribes under his banner, but these confederations were always fragile and temporary. Upon the leader's death, his followers would typically scatter back to their separate clans. The steppe was a place of endless cycles of unity and fragmentation, alliance and betrayal.
It was into this world of violence and instability that a boy was born around the year 1162. His father was a minor chieftain named Yasuge. According to legend, the boy was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, an omen that he was destined to be a great warrior. His father named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain Yasuge had recently captured. No one could have known that this child, born into obscurity and hardship, would one day be known by a different name, a name that would strike terror into the hearts of emperors and kings. Genghis Khan. Temujin's early life was marked by tragedy and betrayal. When he was only 9 years old, his father was poisoned by members of the rival Tatar tribe during a feast. This was a catastrophic blow. Without a strong leader, Temujin's family was immediately abandoned by their clan. His father's followers, unwilling to serve a widow and her children, simply packed up their camps and rode away. Temujin, his mother Hoylun, and his siblings were left alone on the steppe to starve. Most families in this situation would have perished, but Hoylun was a woman of remarkable strength and determination. She kept her children alive through sheer force of will. They survived by fishing, hunting marmots and wild game, and foraging for roots and berries. It was a life of grinding poverty and constant danger. They were outcasts with no protection. They could be robbed, killed, or enslaved by any passing group without consequence. This brutal childhood taught Temujin lessons he would never forget. Survival requires strength. Loyalty is more valuable than gold, and the greatest danger comes from betrayal. The defining trauma of his youth came when he was still a teenager. Members of his own extended clan, fearing Temujin's potential to seek revenge for his father's death and reclaim leadership, decided to eliminate the threat. They raided his family's camp and took him prisoner. He was fitted with a wooden collar called a kang, a heavy board locked around his neck that prevented him from feeding himself or lying down comfortably. He was paraded between camps as a captive slave, humiliated and powerless. But Temujin was already displaying the cunning and ruthless determination that would define his later life. He waited patiently for his opportunity. During a feast, when his captors were drunk, he struck his guard with the kang, knocked him unconscious, and fled into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerged except for his face, while search parties passed nearby. He was eventually helped by a sympathetic man from another family, who hid him and later removed the kang. Temujin never forgot those who helped him in his darkest moments, nor those who betrayed him. As he grew into manhood, Temujin began the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding his father's following. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He sought out powerful patrons who could provide protection and legitimacy. He cultivated personal loyalty through generosity, shared hardship, and proven competence. And most importantly, he chose his followers based on ability and loyalty rather than aristocratic blood or clan membership. This was revolutionary in a society where lineage was everything. His first great alliance was with Togrul, the Khan of the powerful Captivate tribe, and an old ally of his father. Temujin presented himself as a loyal subordinate and served Togrul faithfully, gaining both protection and valuable military experience. He also reconnected with Jamuka, a brother or Bola, with whom Temujin had taken the oath of brotherhood as young children. Together, they gathered bands of outcast warriors and slowly began to carve out a kingdom among the steppe tribes.
Jamuka, a childhood friend who had become a powerful leader in his own right. The two swore an oath of brotherhood, becoming Anda, bound by sacred vows of mutual support. Through a combination of diplomatic marriages, strategic alliances, and small-scale military victories, Temujin slowly built his power base. His reputation grew. He was known as a brilliant tactician, a generous leader who shared plunder fairly with his followers, and a man who valued competence over pedigree. Warriors from other clans began to defect to his banner. This meritocratic approach was deeply threatening to the traditional aristocracy of the steppes, and it would eventually lead to inevitable conflict. The first great test came when Temujin's wife, Borte, was kidnapped by the Merkid tribe in a revenge raid. This was both a personal tragedy and a political crisis. Temujin could not let such an insult stand. He gathered every ally he had, including forces from Togrul and Jamuka, and launched a devastating counter-raid. The Merkid camp was caught by surprise in a dawn attack. Temujin's forces swept through like a whirlwind, slaughtering the warriors and rescuing Borte. The raid was a complete success, and it announced to the steppes that Temujin was no longer a powerless outcast. He was a leader to be reckoned with. But success breeds jealousy and fear. The other Khans began to see Temujin not as a useful ally, but as a dangerous rival. The old aristocratic families, threatened by his meritocratic principles and growing power, began to organize against him. Even his sworn brother Jamuka turned against him, jealous of Temujin's rising influence and philosophical differences about how power should be exercised. The steppes were fracturing into two great camps: those who followed the old ways of blood privilege and tribal hierarchy, led by Jamuka and backed by many established Khans, and those who followed Temujin's new vision of a unified order based on loyalty and ability. The conflict exploded into open warfare in 1201. A grand coalition of traditional Khans elected Jamuka as their leader and declared him Gur Khan, universal ruler. They amassed a huge army and marched against Temujin. The two former blood brothers met in battle. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Temujin's forces were outnumbered and were driven from the field. It appeared that his dream of unification was about to be crushed. But Jamuka made a catastrophic mistake. After his victory, he ordered that captured enemy nobles be executed by boiling them alive in 70 cauldrons. This act of grotesque cruelty horrified many of his own allies. It violated the steppe code of conduct toward fellow Mongols of noble birth. Disgusted by this brutality and impressed by Temujin's reputation for just treatment of prisoners, many of Jamuka's followers defected. Over the next decade, Temujin waged a brilliant campaign of military conquest and political maneuvering. One by one, he defeated or absorbed the tribes of the steppes. The Tatars who had poisoned his father were utterly destroyed. The adult males were systematically killed, and the surviving women and children were distributed among Temujin's followers. It was a brutal act of vengeance, but it sent a clear message. Resistance would be met with annihilation. Submission would be met with integration and reward. He turned against his old patron, Togrul, when the Keret Khan grew fearful of his former protégé's power. In a decisive night battle, Temujin's forces shattered the Keret army. Togrul died fleeing across the Gobi Desert. The wealthy and powerful Keret Confederation was absorbed into Temujin's growing empire. Finally, in 1206, Jamuka himself was betrayed by his own followers and handed over to Temujin. The two men met one last time. According to the chroniclers, Temujin offered his old friend a position of honor if he would submit. Jamuka refused. He asked only for a noble death, one without the spilling of blood. Temujin granted his request. Jamuka was executed by having his back broken, a method considered honorable for nobility. His body was buried with respect. With the defeat of Jamuka, the last serious opposition was eliminated. In the spring of 1206, a great gathering was called at the headwaters of the Anon River. This was a kurultai, a traditional assembly of all the Mongol chiefs and nobles. Representatives from every tribe that had submitted to Temujin's rule were present. In a solemn ceremony beneath the eternal blue sky, the sacred deity of the steppe peoples, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler or oceanic ruler. The scattered, feuding tribes of the Mongolian plateau were now, for the first time in their history, a single, unified nation. But Genghis Khan was not content to simply rule the steppes. A unified Mongolia, no matter how militarily powerful, was still fundamentally poor. The grasslands could support horses and herds, but they produced none of the luxury goods, none of the grain, and none of the wealth that defined great civilizations. To feed his growing nation and reward his loyal followers, Genghis Khan would need to look beyond the steppes. He would need to conquer the settled civilizations that surrounded him. And the first target was the greatest empire in the world, China. At the dawn of the 13th century, China was not a single unified state. It was divided into three major powers, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to ancient Chinese civilization. In the north lay the Jin dynasty, ruled by the Jurchen people, a semi-nomadic group who had conquered northern China a century earlier. The Jin controlled the Yellow River Valley, the ancient heartland of Chinese civilization, including the great former capital of Kaifeng. To the northwest was the Western Shah, a smaller kingdom ruled by the Tangut people, controlling the vital trade routes of the Silk Road. And to the south, across the Yangtze River, was the Song dynasty, the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated of the three, but also the most militarily vulnerable. All three of these powers were immeasurably richer than the Mongol steppes. They possessed vast cities, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated bureaucracies, and standing armies equipped with crossbows, siege engines, and even primitive gunpowder weapons. On paper, any one of them should have been able to crush the primitive horse-mounted barbarians from the north. But they all shared a fatal flaw. They underestimated the Mongols. Genghis Khan's first target was the Western Shah. This was a deliberate choice. The Tangut Kingdom was relatively weak, but it controlled important grazing lands and sections of the Silk Road. More importantly, it would serve as a testing ground for Mongol tactics against fortified cities. In 1209, Genghis Khan led his armies into Shah territory. The Mongol cavalry swept across the countryside, destroying Tangut forces in open battle with ease. But when they reached the walled cities, they faced a problem. The Mongols were masters of mounted warfare, but they had no experience with siegecraft. The Tangut defenders simply retreated behind their walls and waited for the barbarians to exhaust themselves.
Genghis Khan was a pragmatic and adaptive leader. If his people did not know how to breach walls, then he would learn. He recruited Chinese engineers who had fled the Jin dynasty. He studied the siege techniques of the settled civilizations, and he began to incorporate these methods into his military system. The Mongols started to employ Chinese-style siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. They also developed psychological tactics. They would offer generous terms to cities that surrendered immediately. But cities that resisted would be subjected to total destruction. Every inhabitant would be killed as a lesson to others. The campaign against the Western Xia dragged on for several years. The Tangut sued for peace, offering tribute and nominal submission. Genghis Khan accepted, though he did not trust their loyalty. He had achieved his goal. His armies had learned the basics of siege warfare, and he had secured his western flank. Now he could turn his attention to the real prize, the Jin dynasty. The Jin Empire was a formidable opponent. It commanded vast resources and had defeated every steppe confederation that had challenged it over the past century. The Jurchen rulers treated the Mongols with open contempt, regarding them as useful barbarians who could occasionally be hired as mercenaries, but were no real threat. This arrogance would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. In 1211, Genghis Khan launched his invasion of Jin territory. His strategy was methodical and ruthless. Mongol cavalry, organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, swept across the countryside in coordinated attacks. They moved with astonishing speed, covering up to 100 miles per day when necessary. Each warrior had multiple horses, allowing them to rotate mounts and maintain this incredible pace for days or even weeks. The Jin armies tied to slow-moving supply trains and infantry formations simply could not keep up. The Mongols employed sophisticated intelligence networks. They used scouts, spies, and captured prisoners to gather detailed information about enemy positions, fortifications, and troop movements. They were masters of deception, using feigned retreats to draw enemy forces into ambushes. They would pretend to flee in disorder, luring pursuing armies into kill zones where they would be surrounded and annihilated by Mongol reserves. It was a tactic that worked again and again because commanders from settled civilizations could not believe that the barbarian flight was anything other than genuine cowardice. One by one, the great cities of northern China fell. When the Mongols encountered particularly stubborn resistance, they developed increasingly sophisticated siege techniques. They would divert rivers to flood defenses or cut off water supplies. They would build artificial hills to match the height of city walls, allowing archers to shoot down into the defenses. They forced captured civilians to serve as human shields, driving them ahead of the assault troops to absorb defensive fire and fill moats with their bodies. It was warfare of calculated terror, designed not just to capture cities, but to break the will of future opponents. By 1214, the Jin dynasty was in collapse. The Mongols had captured or destroyed dozens of cities. The Jin emperor fled south from Beijing to Kaifeng, abandoning his northern capital. In desperation, he sued for peace, offering a massive tribute of gold, silk, horses, and even an empress princess, a imperial princess, as a bride for Genghis Khan. The great Khan accepted these terms and withdrew his forces. But the peace was short-lived. When Genghis Khan learned that the Jin emperor had abandoned Beijing entirely and moved his capital, he interpreted this as preparation for renewed resistance. In 1215, he returned with overwhelming force. Beijing, one of the greatest cities in the world, was besieged for months. When it finally fell, it was subjected to systematic looting and destruction. Palaces were burned, treasures were loaded onto thousands of carts and sent back to Mongolia. The killing was so extensive that, according to contemporary accounts, the streets were slick with human fat and the bones of the dead formed mounds. The conquest of northern China was a turning point for the Mongol Empire. It brought immense wealth, including vast quantities of gold, silk, and grain. It also brought human capital. Thousands of Chinese craftsmen, engineers, administrators, and scholars were either captured or voluntarily entered Mongol service. These educated individuals would become crucial to the administration of the growing empire. They taught the Mongols the arts of taxation, record-keeping, and governance. They adapted the Uyghur script to write the Mongolian language, giving the Mongols their first writing system. The primitive steppe confederation was beginning to transform into a sophisticated imperial power. But Genghis Khan's ambitions were far from satisfied. To the west lay the vast and wealthy Khwarezmian Empire, controlling the great cities of the Silk Road, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khwarezm itself. This would be the next target, and it would result in one of the most destructive military campaigns in human history. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched from the western borders of China to the shores of the Caspian Sea. It was a prosperous realm, grown rich on the Silk Road trade that flowed through its territories. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, commanded large armies and controlled some of the most magnificent cities in the Islamic world. He had no reason to fear the distant Mongols, and every reason to feel confident in his own power. The catalyst for war was an act of spectacular stupidity. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of 500 merchants to establish commercial relations with Khwarezm. The governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, became suspicious of these foreigners. Acting either on his own paranoid initiative or possibly with secret approval from the Shah, he accused the merchants of being spies, confiscated their valuable goods, and executed the entire caravan. It was an act of brigandage disguised as state security.
Genghis Khan was furious, but he was also a careful leader. He sent 3 ambassadors to the Shah demanding justice, the extradition of Governor Inalchuk, and compensation for the stolen goods. The Shah, either out of pride or a catastrophic failure to understand who he was dealing with, not only refused the demands, but had one of the ambassadors executed and the beards of the other 2 shaved, a terrible insult in Mongol culture. He sent them back to Genghis Khan as a contemptuous rejection. This was the worst mistake of the Shah's life. He had insulted the most powerful military leader in Asia, and he had done so in a way that demanded a response. Genghis Khan prepared for total war. In 1219, he assembled an army of approximately 150,000 to 200,000 warriors, an enormous force by steppe standards. He divided his army into multiple columns, each commanded by his most trusted generals, including his brilliant sons. The Mongol invasion would not follow a single predictable route. It would strike from multiple directions simultaneously, paralyzing the Khwarezmian defenses. The campaign was a masterpiece of strategic planning and psychological warfare. The Mongol armies moved with their characteristic speed, bypassing heavily fortified positions and striking at the weakest points in the Khwarezmian defensive network. They used superior intelligence, gathered from merchants, travelers, and captured prisoners, to know exactly where Shah Muhammad's forces were positioned. They employed feints and diversions, making the Shah believe the main attack was coming from one direction, while the real blow fell elsewhere. City after city fell in rapid succession. Bukhara, one of the jewels of Islamic civilization, a center of learning and culture, was captured after only 3 days. Genghis Khan himself entered the great mosque of the city, climbed into the pulpit, and allegedly declared to the assembled population that he was the punishment of God. If they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. The city was looted, its population enslaved or scattered, and much of it was burned. Samarkand, an even greater city, held out for only 5 days before surrendering. The Mongols promised mercy to those who submitted. This was a lie. After the city's surrender, the entire population was assembled on the plains outside the walls. The skilled craftsmen, metal workers, weavers, engineers were separated out and sent to Mongolia or other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. The young women and strong men were enslaved, and the rest, numbering in the tens of thousands, were methodically killed. Contemporary sources, while likely exaggerated, speak of death tolls in the hundreds of thousands. Shah Muhammad refused to face the Mongols in open battle. Recognizing that his armies were no match for the invaders, he fled from city to city, always staying just ahead of the pursuing Mongol forces. His flight destroyed what remained of Khwarezmian morale. Armies abandoned fortified positions. Governors surrendered without a fight or fled, leaving their cities to their fate. The great empire was collapsing, not through military defeat, but through the complete psychological breakdown of its leadership. Genghis Khan sent 2 of his most capable generals, Jebe and Subutai, in pursuit of the fleeing Shah with a flying column of 20,000 cavalry. They pursued him relentlessly across Persia, covering thousands of miles in months. Everywhere the Shah sought refuge, the Mongols appeared. Finally, exhausted and broken, Shah Muhammad fled to a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died shortly afterward, probably from pneumonia or despair. His empire had been destroyed, his cities laid waste, and his people scattered. The entire conquest had taken less than 2 years. But Jebe and Subutai did not return immediately. With Genghis Khan's permission, they continued westward on one of the most remarkable military expeditions in history. With their 20,000 horsemen, they swept around the Caspian Sea, raiding through the Caucasus Mountains and into the southern steppes of Russia. In 1223, they encountered a combined Rus-Kipchak army, Russian and Cuman army at the Kalkar River. The Russians and Cumans outnumbered the Mongols, possibly by as much as 2 to 1. The battle was a disaster for the Russians. Using their classic tactics of feigned retreat and envelopment, the Mongols lured the Russian cavalry into a trap. The Russian forces were annihilated. The captured Russian princes were bound, placed under wooden boards, and crushed to death under the weight of the Mongol victory feast held on top of them. A traditional steppe execution for high-ranking prisoners that did not spill noble blood. This victory was a harbinger of what was to come. The Mongols had announced their arrival to Eastern Europe. After this incredible raid, spanning thousands of miles and lasting over 3 years, Jebe and Subutai finally returned to Mongolia. They had not only pursued a fleeing emperor to his death, but had also scouted the lands of the West, gathering intelligence for future conquests. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire and the devastation of Central Asia had profound and lasting consequences. Entire cities were left as smoldering ruins. Irrigation systems that had supported agriculture for centuries were destroyed. Populations that had flourished along the Silk Road were killed, scattered, or enslaved. Some regions would not recover for generations. But for the Mongols, it was an unparalleled triumph. The wealth seized from the cities of Khwarezm, Persia, and Afghanistan flowed back to Mongolia. The empire was now truly vast, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Yet, Genghis Khan had unfinished business. The Western Shia, his old enemy, had failed to provide the military support they had promised for the Khwarezmian campaign. This was, in his eyes, a betrayal. In 1226, now in his 60s and still actively commanding armies, he launched a final campaign against the Tongut Kingdom. The campaign was brutal. The Shia forces were crushed. The capital was besieged. But during the campaign, Genghis Khan was injured. Accounts differ as to whether it was from a fall from his horse or in battle. The injury did not heal properly. In August of 1227, the man who had unified the Mongols and conquered half of Asia died in his military camp. His death was kept secret from all but his closest companions. According to tradition, his body was returned to Mongolia and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Khenti Mountains near his birthplace. The exact location has never been found. Anyone who witnessed the funeral procession was killed to preserve the secret. Genghis Khan's death was not the end of the Mongol Empire. It was merely the end of the beginning. His sons and grandsons would continue his conquests, pushing the boundaries of Mongol power even further, until it stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Poland, from Siberia to Vietnam. But that is a story for the next chapter of our journey. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 could have marked the end of the Mongol explosion. History is full of empires built by singular military geniuses that collapsed immediately after their founder's death. The empire of Alexander the Great had fragmented within a generation. The empire of Charlemagne had been divided among his squabbling heirs. But the Mongol Empire was different. Genghis Khan had built not just an army, but a system. And that system would allow his descendants to expand his conquests far beyond even his extraordinary achievements.
According to Mongol tradition and the Yasa, the legal code Genghis Khan had established, the supreme leader of the empire, the Great Khan, was to be elected by a Kurultai, a gathering of the senior princes and commanders. Genghis Khan had 4 legitimate sons by his principal wife Borte: Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. Before his death, Genghis Khan had designated Ogedei as his preferred successor, recognizing that his 3rd son possessed both military ability and, crucially, the diplomatic temperament to hold the empire together. In 1229, a great Kurultai was held on the steppes of Mongolia. Ogedei was formally elected as the 2nd Great Khan. His accession was smooth, largely because Genghis Khan had prepared the succession carefully, and because Ogedei had the support of his brothers, despite the natural jealousies that existed among them. The new Great Khan immediately demonstrated that he would be a worthy successor to his father. He was a capable military commander, but his greatest talents lay in administration and grand strategy. He established the imperial capital at Karakoram, transforming it from a mobile tent city into a permanent settlement with palaces, storehouses, and administrative buildings. Under Ogedei's reign, the Mongol administrative system became more sophisticated. The empire was divided into major appanages, each ruled by a branch of the royal family, but all owing allegiance to the Great Khan. A postal relay system called the Yam was established across the empire. Stations were built every 25 miles or so, stocked with fresh horses and supplies. Authorized messengers carrying the Great Khan's paisa, a tablet of authority, could travel across the empire at astonishing speed, covering over 200 miles per day. This communication network would become one of the empire's greatest administrative achievements, allowing orders and intelligence to flow rapidly across thousands of miles. But Ogedei was not content to merely consolidate his father's conquests. The campaigns of expansion continued. In China, the war against the Jin dynasty was finally brought to a conclusion. In 1234, Jin forces, driven south and cornered, made their last stand in the city of Kaiju. The Mongols, in a temporary alliance with the southern Sung dynasty, besieged and captured the city. The Jin emperor committed suicide rather than face capture. Northern China, which had resisted for over 20 years, was now fully under Mongol control. But the conquest of China was far from complete. The Song dynasty remained independent and wealthy, controlling the richest and most populous regions of China. The Song would not be fully conquered for another 40 years. This was partly because the terrain of southern China, a land of rivers, rice paddies, and tropical heat, was utterly unlike the dry steppes and plains where Mongol cavalry excelled. It was also because the Song possessed sophisticated military technology, including early gunpowder weapons, fire lances, and bombs, which presented new challenges to Mongol tactics. While China simmered, Ogedei turned his attention westward. It was time to complete the conquest of the West that Jebei and Subutai had only scouted. In 1235, a great campaign was planned. At a Kurultai, it was decided that a massive Western army would be assembled under the command of Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and son of Jochi. Assisting him would be Subutai, now in his 60s, but still the most brilliant military strategist in the Mongol Empire. This would not be a raid. This would be a war of systematic conquest. The target was Europe. Between 1236 and 1242, the Mongol armies launched an invasion that would bring death and destruction to Eastern Europe on an unprecedented scale. The campaign began with the conquest of the Volga-Bulgarian state and the various tribes and kingdoms of the Russian steppes. Then the Mongols turned their attention to the Russian principalities themselves. These were a collection of feudal states, wealthy from trade, but politically divided and militarily unprepared for what was about to descend upon them. In 1237, the Mongol army, numbering perhaps 150,000 warriors, attacked the Principality of Ryazan. The Russians sent desperate appeals for aid to neighboring princes. None came. Each prince believed he could make his own accommodation with the invaders, or that the danger did not concern him directly. This fatal disunity sealed their fate. Ryazan held out for 5 days before falling. The city was completely destroyed, its population massacred. One contemporary chronicler recorded that no eye remained to weep for the dead. The pattern was repeated across Russia. City after city fell. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, all were captured and burned during the winter campaign of 1237-1238. The Mongols demonstrated their complete mastery of winter warfare. While European armies typically ceased operations in winter due to the difficulty of moving and supplying forces in snow and ice, the Mongols used the frozen rivers as highways. Their horses, smaller and hardier than European breeds, could forage for food beneath the snow. They moved faster and struck harder during winter than at any other time. In 1240, the ancient and venerable city of Kiev, the mother city of Russian civilization, was besieged. After a fierce defense, the city fell. It was so thoroughly destroyed that when a visitor came several years later, he reported finding barely 200 houses still standing in what had been one of the greatest cities of Eastern Europe. From Russia, the Mongols pushed into Poland and Hungary. In April 1241, 2 Mongol armies, operating in perfect coordination despite being separated by hundreds of miles, won 2 decisive victories on the same day. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a Mongol force defeated a combined Polish-German army. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, Subutai commanded a brilliant operation that annihilated the Hungarian army and killed perhaps a quarter of the Hungarian population in the devastation that followed. All of Western Europe was gripped by panic. The chroniclers had no framework for understanding this sudden catastrophic invasion. Many believed it was a punishment from God, the coming of the apocalypse. Refugee populations fled westward with tales of demonic invaders who drank blood and fed their horses on human flesh. Kingdoms scrambled to raise armies. The Pope called for a crusade. But before Western Europe could organize an effective response, the Mongol armies simply stopped. In December of 1241, messengers arrived from Mongolia with stunning news. Great Khan Ogedei had died. According to Mongol law and tradition, all the princes had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan, who was on the verge of potentially conquering all of Europe, turned his armies around and began the long journey home. Europe had been saved, not by military resistance, but by a death thousands of miles away and the Mongol adherence to their own succession laws. Batu never returned to Europe. The political situation in Mongolia was complex, with competing factions supporting different candidates for the succession. Eventually, in 1246,
Ogedei's son Guyuk was elected Great Khan, but he died after only 2 years. The succession crisis deepened, with different branches of the family vying for supreme power. Finally, in 1251, Mongke Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through his youngest son Tolui, was elected. He would prove to be one of the most effective of all the great Khans. Mongke immediately set about restoring order and discipline to an empire that had become somewhat lax during the succession disputes. He conducted a purge of corrupt officials and reasserted central authority. But most importantly, he resumed the campaigns of conquest. He organized 2 great simultaneous campaigns. One would be directed against the Song dynasty in China, completing the conquest his grandfather had begun. The other would be aimed at the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East, destroying what remained of the Abbasid Caliphate and establishing Mongol dominance over Persia, Iraq, and Syria. The Western campaign was entrusted to Mongke's brother, Hulegu. In 1256, Hulegu departed Mongolia with a massive army, perhaps 120,000 strong, including significant contingents of Chinese engineers and siege specialists. His first target was not a conventional kingdom, but something far more dangerous and insidious: the assassins. This was a radical Shia sect that had terrorized the Islamic world for over a century from their network of supposedly impregnable mountain fortresses in Persia. They practiced targeted political murder, sending fanatical devotees on suicide missions to kill sultans, generals, and caliphs. They had murdered numerous rulers and had become almost mythical in their fearsome reputation. Hulegu methodically besieged and captured their fortresses one by one. The Mongol siege engines, operated by Chinese experts, reduced stone castles that had been considered unassailable. The last Grand Master of the assassins surrendered his remaining fortresses in exchange for promises of mercy. Hulegu had him executed anyway. The assassin strongholds were demolished, their libraries burned, and their members hunted down and killed. A threat that had plagued the Middle East for generations was eliminated in a single campaign. With the assassins destroyed, Hulegu turned to an even more audacious target: Baghdad. This was not just another city. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic center of Sunni Islam, one of the greatest cities in the world. For 500 years, the Abbasid caliphs had been the theoretical leaders of the Islamic world.
Though their actual political power had diminished, their religious and cultural authority remained immense. Baghdad was a city of perhaps 1 million inhabitants, filled with libraries, observatories, hospitals, and magnificent palaces. It was a center of learning where scholars from across the Islamic world gathered. The Caliph al-Mustasim was a weak and indecisive ruler. He had ignored the threat of the Mongols, believing that his religious authority would protect him, or that other Muslim powers would come to his aid. When Hulegu's envoys arrived demanding submission, the Caliph's vizier counseled resistance. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In January 1258, Mongol armies surrounded Baghdad. The siege was brief. The city's defenses, which had not been seriously tested in centuries, crumbled under the assault of Mongol siege engines and tactics. The Mongols breached the walls and poured into the city. What followed was a massacre of almost unimaginable scale. For a week, the Mongol soldiers were given free rein to loot and kill. Contemporary accounts, while probably
exaggerated estimates, speak of death tolls ranging from 200,000 to over 1 million. The great libraries, including the House of Wisdom, were destroyed. Thousands of irreplaceable books and manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris River. It was said the river ran black with ink and red with blood. The Caliph himself was captured and, according to tradition, executed by being rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. A bloodless execution reserved for royalty, but one that conveyed utter contempt. The destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. The symbolic heart of Sunni Islam had been obliterated. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for over 5 centuries, was extinguished. The Mongols had accomplished what no previous invader had managed. They had destroyed the political and religious center of one of the world's great civilizations. Hulegu established his capital at Tabriz in Persia and founded what would become known as the Ilkhanate, the Mongol realm of the Middle East. But the Mongol advance was not unstoppable. When Hulegu pushed further west into Syria and approached the borders of Egypt, he finally met serious resistance. The Egyptian Mamluks, an elite military caste of slave soldiers who had seized power in Cairo, prepared to defend their realm. In 1260, news arrived that Great Khan Mongke had died during the siege of a Chinese fortress. Following Mongol tradition, Hulegu withdrew the bulk of his forces and returned toward Mongolia, leaving behind only a reduced garrison under one of his generals. The Mamluks saw their opportunity. In September 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, a Mamluk army confronted and defeated the Mongol forces. It was a shocking upset. For the first time, a Mongol army had been decisively beaten in open battle. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. The surviving Mongol forces retreated back into Mesopotamia. The Mamluks pursued, eventually stabilizing the frontier and preventing further Mongol expansion into Africa or the eastern Mediterranean. The Battle of Ain Jalut was a turning point. It established the western limits of Mongol expansion, but it also signaled the beginning of a new phase in Mongol history. The unity of the empire was beginning to fracture.
When Mongke died, a succession crisis erupted that would tear the empire apart. Two of Mongke's brothers, Kublai and Arik-Bokhe, both claimed the title of Great Khan. For the first time, rival Kurultais were held, each electing a different candidate. Civil war erupted between the two factions. Kublai eventually prevailed in 1264, but the damage was done. The other branches of the Mongol royal family, Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia under the descendants of Batu, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, paid only nominal allegiance to Kublai. In practice, they ruled as independent kingdoms. The unified Mongol Empire, which had been a single entity under Genghis Khan, Ogedai, and Mongke, was now effectively a collection of separate but related states. They shared a common heritage, culture, and often cooperated, but they also sometimes fought each other. Kublai Khan, now the fifth great Khan, but ruling over a fragmented empire, would focus his efforts on the conquest that had eluded his predecessors, the complete subjugation of China. This campaign would define his reign and would result in the transformation of the Mongol Empire into something fundamentally new. It would become not just a collection of conquered territories, but a Chinese dynasty, the Yuan.
The Southern Song dynasty was the richest and most populous of all the Mongol enemies. It controlled southern China, a region of great rivers, mountains, and humid subtropical climate. The terrain was utterly unsuitable for traditional Mongol cavalry tactics. The Song also possessed sophisticated military technology, including the most advanced gunpowder weapons in the world and a powerful navy that controlled the rivers and coastline. This would not be a quick conquest. Kublai approached the problem with characteristic Mongol adaptability. If cavalry could not conquer the south, then he would build a navy. Mongol commanders, who had spent their entire lives on horseback, learned the art of naval warfare. Chinese shipbuilders and sailors entered Mongol service in large numbers. Siege engineers developed specialized equipment for attacking fortified river cities. The campaign was methodical and grinding, focused on capturing key strategic points and slowly constricting the Song realm. The war lasted over 15 years. City by city, province by province, the Mongols pushed south. The Song resisted desperately, but they were plagued by internal political divisions and could not match the single-minded determination of Kublai's forces. The climax came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen. The last Song emperor, a child named Zhao Bing, fled with the remnants of the Song court and navy to a small island. The Mongol fleet, now massive and well-trained, surrounded them. When defeat became inevitable, a loyal minister took the young emperor in his arms and leapt into the sea, drowning them both, rather than face capture. With the death of the last Song emperor, China was unified under foreign rule for the first time in its history. The Mongol conquest was complete. Kublai Khan declared himself not just a Mongol Khan, but a Chinese emperor, founding the Yuan dynasty. He moved his capital from Karakorum to a new city built near the ruins of old Beijing called Khanbalik, meaning City of the Khan. This was not just a change of location. It represented a fundamental transformation in Mongol identity. Kublai attempted to balance his dual role as both Mongol Khan and Chinese emperor. He adopted many Chinese administrative practices and rituals while preserving Mongol military dominance.
He employed Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian administrators in his government, creating a multicultural bureaucracy. He patronized Chinese arts and Buddhism, but also maintained Mongol customs and the primacy of Mongol nobles. It was a delicate balancing act, and not all Mongols approved. Many felt he was abandoning their traditions and becoming too Chinese. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai presided over an era of remarkable prosperity and cultural exchange. China's population, which had declined dramatically during the Mongol invasions, began to recover. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, which was now united under Mongol control for its entire length. Merchants could travel from Europe to China with a single passport, the Mongol paisa. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed in both directions at an unprecedented rate. It was during this time that the most famous European traveler arrived at Kublai's court. Marco Polo, whom we mentioned earlier, spent nearly 2 decades in Mongol service, traveling throughout the empire and serving as an official for the Great Khan. His account, though often doubted by his contemporaries, provided Europe with its first detailed descriptions of China and the East. He wrote of paper money, coal, the postal system, and the vast wealth and sophistication of Chinese cities. His descriptions would inspire generations of European explorers and merchants. But Kublai's reign was not without serious failures. He launched 2 massive and disastrous invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281. Both were turned back, the second by a combination of stubborn Japanese resistance and a typhoon that destroyed much of the Mongol fleet. The Japanese called this divine wind kamikaze. Kublai also launched costly and ultimately unsuccessful campaigns in Southeast Asia against Vietnam, Burma, and Java. The Mongol military machine, so successful on the steppes and in dry climates, proved far less effective in tropical jungles and against determined local resistance. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, he was succeeded by a series of increasingly ineffectual emperors. The Yuan dynasty would continue for another 70 years, but its vitality was fading. The later Yuan emperors were Chinese in culture and outlook, having lost the martial vigor of their Mongol ancestors. Internal strife, corruption, natural disasters, and eventually peasant rebellions would bring down the dynasty. In 1368, a former Buddhist monk turned rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang drove the last Yuan emperor back to Mongolia and founded the Ming dynasty. China was once again ruled by a native Chinese house. But this was only the collapse of one part of the Mongol world. In Russia, Persia, and Central Asia, Mongol successor states would endure for much longer. The political fragmentation of the empire did not mean the end of Mongol power or influence. It simply meant that power was now distributed across multiple centers. Each of these Mongol realms developed its own unique character, adapting to local conditions while maintaining elements of their Mongol heritage. And the legacy of the empire they had built together would reshape the entire world. The Mongol Empire, as a single unified political entity, effectively ended with the succession crisis after Mongke died in 1260. But the various Mongol khanates that emerged from this fragmentation were powerful states in their own right, each ruling vast territories and diverse populations. These successor states would last for centuries, and their legacy would shape the political geography of Eurasia down to the modern era. In the western steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde emerged as the most enduring of the Mongol successor states. Founded by Batu Khan and his descendants, it controlled the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, including all of the Russian principalities. The Russians called this period the Tartar Yoke, a time of foreign domination that would last for nearly 2.5 centuries and profoundly shape Russian political culture and identity. The Golden Horde did not rule Russia directly. Instead, they employed a system of indirect control that was both effective and economical. The various Russian princes were allowed to retain their titles and govern their own territories, but they had to travel to the Horde's capital at Sarai on the Volga River to receive a yarlik, a patent of authority from the Khan. They were required to pay heavy annual tribute in silver, furs, and other goods. Failure to pay, or any act of defiance, would result in a devastating punitive raid by Mongol cavalry.
This system created intense competition among the Russian princes. They would betray each other, inform on rivals to the Mongol authorities, and compete for the Khan's favor to receive the title of Grand Prince, which came with the right to collect tribute from the other princes. The Mongols expertly manipulated these rivalries, playing one prince against another to prevent any unified Russian resistance. It was a strategy of divide and rule applied with ruthless efficiency. Over time, one principality began to emerge as the primary collector of Mongol tribute and the Khan's favored intermediary, Moscow. The princes of Moscow were shrewd collaborators who enriched themselves by collecting tribute for their Mongol overlords, while simultaneously strengthening their own power base. By the early 14th century, Moscow had become the most powerful Russian city, eclipsing older centers like Kiev and Vladimir. The foundations of Russian autocracy, with its emphasis on centralized power and absolute obedience to the ruler, were forged during this period of submission to Mongol authority. The Golden Horde itself gradually converted to Islam in the early 14th century, further differentiating it from its Russian subjects. The Khans adopted Turco-Islamic court culture while maintaining their Mongol military traditions. Their capital, at Sarai, became a wealthy cosmopolitan city, a center of trade connecting Europe and Asia. But like all the Mongol successor states, the Golden Horde eventually began to fragment. By the 15th century, it had split into several smaller khanates, Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, and others. It was during this period of Mongol weakness that Moscow finally made its bid for independence. In 1380, Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow led a coalition of Russian forces against a Golden Horde army at the Battle of Kulikovo. The Russians won a surprising victory, the first major defeat of Mongol forces on Russian soil. Though Mongol power was reasserted shortly afterward, the psychological effect was profound. Russians had proven that the Mongols were not invincible. A century later, in 1480, Ivan III of Moscow formally refused to pay tribute. When a Mongol army marched to enforce submission, the two forces faced each other across the Ugra River, but neither attacked. After a tense standoff, the Mongol army withdrew. The Tartar yoke was over. But the Mongol influence on Russia did not end with political independence.
Russian military organization, postal systems, tax collection, and even aspects of court ritual bore the deep imprint of Mongol models. The very concept of Russian autocracy, with the Tsar as an absolute ruler holding power over life and death, echoed the authority of the Mongol Khan. The Russian Empire that would eventually expand across Siberia to the Pacific Ocean was in many ways the heir to Mongol imperial traditions. In Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulegu, developed very differently. The Ilkhans ruled over one of the most sophisticated and culturally advanced regions in the world. Unlike the Golden Horde, which remained nomadic in character, the Ilkhans quickly became sedentary rulers, adopting Persian administrative practices and court culture. They were initially shamanists and Buddhists, with a notable tolerance for Christianity, particularly the Nestorian branch that was common in Central Asia. This created a peculiar and tense relationship with their Muslim subjects. The Ilkhans had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims,
employed Christians and Jews in high positions, which outraged the Muslim religious establishment. But they also needed the cooperation of the Persian bureaucracy and religious authorities to effectively govern their realm. This tension was eventually resolved through conversion. In 1295, Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam, and most of the Mongol elite followed. The Ilkhanate transformed into an Islamic state, though one that retained many Mongol traditions and laws. Under Ghazan and his successor Uljetu, the Ilkhanate experienced a cultural renaissance. Persian art, literature, and architecture flourished. The Mongol patronage brought together Persian, Chinese, and Islamic artistic traditions, creating a unique hybrid style. The most famous example is the Ilkhanid school of miniature painting, which combined Chinese painting techniques with Persian and Islamic themes. Historical writing also flourished. The great historian Rashid al-Din, a Persian Jew who converted to Islam and served as vizier, wrote the Jami al-Tawarikh, the compendium of chronicles, the first truly world history that attempted to document the history of all peoples from China to Europe. But the Ilkhanate was troubled by severe economic problems. The Mongol conquests had devastated the region's agricultural infrastructure. The sophisticated irrigation systems of Mesopotamia and Persia had been destroyed. The tax base had collapsed. The Ilkhans responded by debasing the currency and imposing oppressive taxation, which only worsened the economic crisis. After Uljetu's death in 1316, the Ilkhanate rapidly disintegrated into civil war among competing factions. By 1335, the last nominal Ilkhan was dead, and the realm fragmented into a patchwork of petty successor states. The dream of a unified Mongol kingdom in the Middle East was over. But from these ashes would emerge the last and most destructive wave of conquest from the steppe, the empire of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur was not technically a Mongol. He was a Turco-Mongol warrior from a minor noble family in Central Asia, but he claimed descent from Genghis Khan through his mother
and styled himself as the restorer of the Mongol Empire. Between 1370 and his death in 1405, Timur carved out a vast empire stretching from India to Turkey through campaigns of extraordinary brutality that rivaled or exceeded even the Mongol conquests. Timur's invasions of India, Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia were characterized by systematic massacres and the construction of towers built from the skulls of his victims. When he captured the Indian city of Delhi in 1398, he ordered the massacre of its entire Hindu population, possibly 100,000 people. When Isfahan revolted against his rule, he killed all 70,000 inhabitants and built towers from their skulls. His conquests devastated regions that had barely recovered from the earlier Mongol invasions. But he was also a patron of art and learning, making his capital at Samarkand one of the most beautiful cities in the world, filled with magnificent mosques, madrasas, and gardens. Timur died in 1405 while preparing an invasion of Ming China. His empire, like those of his Mongol predecessors, quickly fragmented among his sons and grandsons. But his descendant Babur would found the Mughal Empire in India in 1526, establishing a dynasty that would rule much of the subcontinent until the British conquest. The Mongols, whose very name was a corruption of Mongol, were the final flowering of the Mongol imperial tradition, blending Mongol, Persian, and Indian cultures into a magnificent synthesis. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate occupied the ancestral Mongol homeland and the vital Silk Road cities. It was the most traditionally Mongol of the successor states, maintaining nomadic customs longer than the others. But it was also politically unstable, constantly torn between its nomadic and settled populations. The eastern portion, centered on the steppes, remained nomadic and shamanistic. The western portion, which included the great cities of Transoxiana, like Samarkand and Bukhara, became increasingly sedentary and Muslim. This internal division eventually led to the formal split of the Chagatai Khanate into eastern and western halves. The western half would eventually fall to Timur, while the eastern half would persist until the 17th century, gradually being absorbed by the expanding Qing dynasty of China. But throughout this period, Central Asia remained a zone of cultural mixing, where Mongol, Turkic, Persian, and Chinese influences blended together, creating the unique cultural character of the region. The most successful Mongol successor state, paradoxically, was the Yuan dynasty in China, which was also the shortest-lived as a Mongol entity. As we have seen, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown in 1368, and the Mongol elite was driven back to the steppes. But Mongolia itself would never again achieve the unity or power it had possessed under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors. The Mongols reverted to their pre-imperial state of feuding tribes and small confederations. Various Mongol leaders would periodically unite portions of the steppe and raid Chinese borders, but none could recreate the empire. The most successful was Altan Khan in the 16th century, who unified the southern Mongols and launched devastating raids into Ming China. But ultimately, the Mongols' future lay not in independence, but in absorption by larger empires. The southern Mongols were eventually incorporated into the Qing dynasty of China, while the northern Mongols fell under Russian influence and eventually became the modern nation of Mongolia. Yet the Mongol legacy extended far beyond these successor states and their eventual decline. The Mongol Empire had fundamentally reshaped the political, cultural, and economic landscape of Eurasia in ways that would have lasting consequences. Perhaps the most significant legacy was in the realm of trade and cultural exchange. The Mongol conquests, brutal as they were, had for the first time united the entire Eurasian landmass under related ruling houses. The Mongol Peace, or Pax Mongolica, was the period from roughly 1250 to 1330, when the Silk Road was safer and more active than at any previous time in history. Merchants could travel from Venice to Beijing with a single passport. Christian missionaries traveled to China and established communities there. Muslim scholars served in Chinese courts. Chinese technology, particularly printing and gunpowder, spread westward. Persian and Islamic scientific and mathematical knowledge traveled eastward. This exchange was not always peaceful or pleasant, but it was unprecedented in scale. The most famous participants in this exchange were the European merchants and missionaries who ventured into the Mongol realms. Marco Polo's account, though sometimes questioned, was only the most famous of many European travelogues describing the wonders of the East. The Franciscan friar William of Rubric traveled to Karakorum in the 1250s and wrote detailed descriptions of Mongol customs and the various peoples he encountered. John of Montecorvino became the first Catholic Archbishop of Beijing. The Venetian merchant community in Tabriz was so large that it had its own church and consul. This cultural exchange also facilitated the spread of technologies that would reshape warfare and society. Gunpowder, which had been invented in China centuries earlier, spread westward through the Mongol Empire. By the 14th century, cannons and firearms were beginning to appear in European armies. The printing press, another Chinese invention, was similarly transmitted westward, where it would eventually be adapted and perfected by Johannes Gutenberg. The compass, gunpowder, and printing, the three technologies that Francis Bacon would later identify as having changed the face of the world, all reached Europe through the Mongol trading networks. But the Mongol Empire also facilitated a darker exchange: disease. The Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, almost certainly spread along the Mongol trade routes. The plague was endemic in the rodent populations of Central Asia. As Mongol armies and trade caravans crisscrossed Eurasia, they carried infected fleas and rats with them. The plague reached the Black Sea ports by 1346, probably carried by Mongol armies besieging the trading city of Kaffa. From there, it spread by ship to Europe, devastating the continent. The political legacy of the Mongol Empire was equally profound. The Mongols had demonstrated that vast territorial empires spanning multiple climates and cultures could be effectively administered. Their postal system, their methods of taxation, their use of census data, and their religious tolerance, at least in the pre-conversion period, became models for later empires.
the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires of the early modern period all incorporated elements of Mongol administrative practice. In Russia, as we have noted, the influence was particularly strong. The Muscovite state that emerged from Mongol domination had adopted many elements of Mongol governance, including census-taking, postal systems, and centralized autocratic rule. When Russian expansion eventually carried the Russian Empire across Siberia to the Pacific, it was following the path of Mongol expansion, and its methods of governing diverse subject peoples owed much to Mongol precedent. In China, the Yuan dynasty's century of rule had lasting effects despite its eventual overthrow. The Mongols had established Beijing as the permanent capital of China, a status it has retained to this day. They had unified North and South, which the subsequent Ming and Qing dynasties would maintain. They had promoted a degree of social mobility and meritocracy that, while offensive to Confucian conservatives, had demonstrated that non-traditional paths to power were possible. And they had opened China to the wider world in unprecedented ways, an opening that would not be fully closed even by later, more isolationist dynasties. The Mongol Empire had also served as a crucible for the mixing of peoples and cultures. The Mongols themselves intermarried extensively with their subject peoples. In Russia, many noble families claimed Mongol descent. In Persia, the Ilkhanid Mongols had become essentially Persian in culture. In China, Mongol identity gradually merged with northern Chinese identity. This mixing created new ethnic and cultural identities. The Tatars, the Uzbeks, the Mongols, all of these were hybrid identities born from the fusion of Mongol conquerors with subject populations. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol conquests had demonstrated the military obsolescence of fragmented feudal states when faced with a unified, disciplined, and tactically innovative enemy. The devastation they wrought forced surviving states to modernize their military and administrative systems. The Ottoman Empire, which would come to dominate much of the Middle East and Eastern Europe in the centuries after the Mongol collapse, was in many ways a response to and an adaptation of the Mongol challenge. Its Janissary Corps, its use of gunpowder weapons, and its centralized administration all represented attempts to match or exceed Mongol military effectiveness. The memory of the Mongol conquests remained powerful long after the empire had fragmented and declined. In the Islamic world, the destruction of Baghdad and the overthrow of the Abbasid Caliphate was remembered as one of the greatest catastrophes in Islamic history. Scholars debated for centuries what the conquests meant. Were they a divine punishment, a test, or simply the result of Muslim disunity? The trauma shaped Islamic political and religious thought for generations. In Russia, the memory of the Tartar yoke became central to Russian national identity. It was remembered as a dark period of foreign oppression, though historians have noted that this narrative simplified a more complex reality of cooperation and cultural exchange. The eventual overthrow of Mongol domination became a foundational myth of Russian nationalism, part of a narrative of Russia as the defender of Christendom against Asian barbarism. In China, the memory of the Yuan dynasty was more ambiguous. On one hand, it was seen as a period of foreign domination, a humiliation that had to be avenged.
The Ming dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols, promoted a narrative of Chinese cultural and moral superiority, reasserting itself over barbarian military might. On the other hand, the Yuan dynasty was also recognized as a legitimate dynasty in the traditional sequence of Chinese history, and some of its achievements, particularly in arts and culture, were celebrated. In Mongolia itself, the memory of the empire became the centerpiece of national identity. Genghis Khan was transformed from a historical figure into a mythic founder hero. Under the Soviet period, when Mongolia was effectively a Soviet satellite state, the celebration of Genghis Khan was suppressed as potentially nationalist and destabilizing. But after Mongolia gained full independence in 1990, there was an explosion of public celebration of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's image appeared on currency. His name was given to airports, hotels, and countless businesses. Mongolia had found its unique identity in the memory of empire. In the West, the Mongol Empire was long remembered primarily as a terrifying invasion that had threatened medieval Europe. Medieval chroniclers portrayed the Mongols as demons, as the servants of the Antichrist, as divine punishment for Christian sins. This image was reinforced during the Cold War, when the Mongol hordes became a metaphor for feared Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Only in recent decades have Western historians begun to appreciate the complexity of the Mongol Empire, recognizing it not just as a destructive force, but as a sophisticated political entity that had facilitated cultural exchange and left an indelible mark on world history. The physical remains of the Mongol Empire are scattered across Eurasia. In Mongolia itself, the ruins of Karakorum, the first Mongol capital, have been partially excavated and reconstructed. The Erdenezu Monastery, built on the ruins of the old capital in the 16th century, still stands as a testament to the site's historical importance. The search for Genghis Khan's tomb continues, though his unmarked grave has never been found, and probably never will be, hidden somewhere in the sacred Khenti Mountains. In China, the palaces of Kublai Khan's Khanbalik have long since vanished, built over by successive reconstructions of Beijing. But the city's layout, with the Forbidden City at its heart, still reflects the Mongol period. The magnificent Summer Palace and other imperial sites preserve elements of the Yuan dynasty's aesthetic vision. Throughout Inner Mongolia, there are monuments and museums dedicated to the Mongol Empire, celebrating the period when Mongols ruled all of China. In Central Asia, the great cities of the Silk Road bear the marks of successive Mongol rulers. Samarkand, which was destroyed by Genghis Khan and later rebuilt by Timur, is filled with magnificent Islamic architecture from the Timurid period, representing the final flowering of Mongol-inspired imperial culture. The Registan, with its 3 massive madrasas, is one of the most spectacular architectural ensembles in the Islamic world, a testament to the wealth and cultural sophistication that the Mongol-descended rulers commanded. In Persia, now Iran, the Ilkhanid period left a rich artistic legacy. The Blue Dome tomb of Olcaytu at Sultaniye is one of the masterpieces of Islamic architecture, its size and ambition reflecting the imperial pretensions of the Ilkhans. Museums in Tehran, Tabriz, and other cities preserve Ilkhanid manuscripts, ceramics, and metalwork, showing the sophisticated hybrid culture that emerged from the meeting of Mongol, Persian, and Chinese traditions. In Russia, the cities of the Golden Horde along the Volga River have mostly vanished, though archaeologists continue to excavate the ruins of Sarai and other sites. But the influence of the Mongol period is visible in Russian art, language, and political culture. Numerous Russian words are of Mongol or Turkic origin, particularly in the domains of administration and military affairs. The architecture of medieval Russian fortifications and the layout of Russian cities owe something to Mongol models. And the political culture of autocracy and centralized control that characterized Imperial Russia cannot be fully understood without reference to the Mongol period. In Europe, there are fewer physical remains, since Mongol control never extended deeply into the continent. But in Hungary and Poland, which suffered from Mongol invasions, there are memorials and museums documenting the catastrophe. The Mongol invasions became part of the national mythology of these countries, remembered as moments of heroic, if ultimately futile, resistance. The story of the Mongol Empire is, in the end, a story of transformation. It began with a society of illiterate nomadic herders living in felt tents on the grasslands of Central Asia. Within a century, these people had conquered half the known world and established the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They had destroyed ancient civilizations.
They built new ones. They had facilitated the greatest exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures that the pre-modern world had ever seen. And then, with surprising rapidity, their unified empire had fragmented and declined, leaving behind a complex legacy that would shape the development of Eurasia for centuries to come. The Mongols proved that a small, initially primitive society could, through superior military organization, tactical flexibility, and ruthless determination, overwhelm vastly larger and more sophisticated civilizations. They demonstrated the potential of merit-based military organization and the effectiveness of strategic mobility. But they also demonstrated the ultimate limits of conquest. Political unity imposed by military force is difficult to maintain across vast distances and diverse populations. Without a shared culture, religion, or economic system to bind it together, the Mongol Empire was destined to fragment. Yet in fragmenting, the Mongol Empire seeded a new world. The successor states, while no longer united, carried forward elements of Mongol imperial practice. The trade networks they had established continued to function. The technologies they had helped to spread, gunpowder, printing, and new agricultural techniques, continued to transform societies. The very trauma of conquest forced the surviving civilizations to adapt, to modernize, and to develop new forms of political and military organization. The Mongol Empire was not, as medieval chroniclers portrayed it, simply a wave of destruction that swept across the world and then receded. It was a catalyst for change, a force that broke apart old orders and created the conditions for new ones to emerge. The world that existed after the Mongol conquests was fundamentally different from the world that existed before. Political boundaries had been redrawn. Populations had been mixed and displaced. Technologies had been shared. And perhaps most importantly, a new awareness had emerged of the interconnectedness of Eurasia, of the fact that events in China could have consequences in Europe, and vice versa.
The Mongol Empire demonstrated both the awesome power of human organization when directed toward conquest and the ultimate fragility of empires built primarily on military force. It showed that even the most sophisticated civilizations could be defeated by a determined and innovative enemy. But it also showed that conquest alone is not enough to build lasting unity. Without shared institutions, shared culture, and shared purpose beyond the accumulation of tribute, even the largest empire will eventually fracture along the fault lines of language, religion, and regional interest. And so our story of the Mongol Empire comes to a close. From the wind-swept grasslands of Mongolia, a confederation of nomadic tribes rose to conquer half the world. They built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They facilitated an unprecedented exchange of ideas and technologies across Eurasia. They destroyed ancient civilizations and built new ones. And then, within a few generations, their unified empire fragmented, leaving behind a complex and contested legacy that continues to shape our world today. The thunder of Mongol hooves has long since faded. The great Khans sleep in unmarked graves. The empire they built exists now only in ruins, in historical records, and in the genetic and cultural heritage of millions of people across Eurasia. But the story of the Mongols remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in human history, a testament to
What can be achieved through vision, organization, and ruthless determination, and a reminder of both the transformative power and the ultimate limits of conquest. Thank you for joining me on this journey across the steppes and into the heart of the greatest land empire the world has ever known. Until our next adventure into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.